Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. In modern science fiction, few authors are measured as widely in influence as Kim Stanley Robinson. Author of the now legendary and revolutionary at the time of its release, the Mars Trilogy, which the New York Times hailed as conceptually and stylistically a landmark in the history of the genre, featuring the iconic red Mars, green Mars, and blue Mars. Establishing Robinson in the esteemed opinion of Time magazine as perhaps the foremost practitioner of literary utopias, he solidified this reputation with other trilogies, including Orange County, consisting of The Wild Shore, The Gold Coast, and The Pacific Edge, and The Science of the Capital series, comprised of 40 Signs of Rain, 50 Degrees Below, and 60 Days and Counting. Winner of every award known to science fiction, including Best Novel from the Nebula, Locust, British Science Fiction, Hugo, and John C. Campbell Memorial Awards, Wired would spotlight Robinson as one of the solar system's preeminent writers of climate change-driven, politically astute science fiction, courtesy in part to an influential run of solo novels dating back 4 decades with Icehenge, The Memory of Whiteness, Antarctica, The Years of Rice and Salt, Galileo's Dream, Shaman, a Novel of Ice Age, Aurora, New York 2140, Red Moon, the celebrated 2312, and The Ministry of the Future in 2020, which helped establish and maintain throughout generations what the LA Times has crowned a superlative reputation for science fictional extrapolation, and his memoir High Sierra, a love story, most recently. Acknowledged in 2016 with the Robert A. Heinlein Award for his entire body of work, and equally as prestigiously in 2018 with the Arthur C. Clarke Award for Imagination to Service in Society, Variety broke the news that Spike TV had greenlit a straight-to-series 10-episode order for Red Mars, highlighting the fact that it's regarded as one of the best novels ever written on the subject, adding that Robinson's trilogy has been adapted in 21 languages. Praised by National Public Radio as a wonderfully gifted and entertaining science fiction writer whose cutting-edge way with words the National Space Society has raved leaves the reader wanting more. He joins us today for a rare interview spanning the entire galaxy of his catalog and career. Dr. Robinson, it is a privilege. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hi.
We've heard time and again of how book clubs were a wonderful introduction for many of your peers to the wide world of reading. Please take fans through your own personal collection if you would, and where along that line you first became a science fiction fan.
My parents had me signed up for the Scholastic Book Club. And so for a quarter, I believe, a month, a book would come once a month that was selected by Scholastic Book Club. So this would be like Castaways in Lilliput, or Pursuit in the French Alps, or The Road to Agra, or The Secret of the Old Postbox. There wasn't YA in my day. I guess I'm talking here about the early 1960s. And it's interesting, people who are about my age, we've read the same children's literature, is what it was called, because of this Scholastic Book Club. Editors were making smart choices. The books were great. I still own several of my original copies that my mom had me write my name and the date in the flyleaf. And I bought some older copies because there were millions of them. They were printed by the hundreds of thousands for this book club in used bookstores to read to my son. So I began with that. I became a fan of mystery detective stories. John Dixon Carr, Ellery Queen, Agatha Christie was not as good as those guys, but I was a mystery fan. And then I got into science fiction really late in the game compared to most science fiction writers. I was going to college, and I was reading methodically through my library, A through Z. And at the end of Z's came science fiction with the radar symbol, the radar and the rocket ship, the radioactive symbol on the spine of science fiction books in that era in libraries. And it was Asimov who I picked up, and then also Clifford Simak. It was a random choice. I picked up one Clifford Simak paperback, and it was good. And I realized that if I could just pick up a random science fiction paperback and it was that good, that the whole genre was going to be good, which wasn't quite true, but it got me going about age 18.
What about within the academic arena? Were there teachers that encouraged or inspired you?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you asked. I began to try to write things like John Dixon Carr, who wrote historicals. He was kind of melodramatic, but he was clever. The first person on top of Mount Everest, having crawled up there on his knees, was John Wilkes Booth, who threw himself off the North Side in his guilt over assassinating Lincoln. I mean, these were the kind of things I was penning, sixth grade maybe. But the thing is, I would read them and I would say, wow, this is harder than I thought, because what I had written was not good. And I would put it aside, and years would pass. But speaking of high school teachers, I had Mrs. Catherine Lee. She taught British literature in my senior year of high school. And this woman was lovely. She went to England every summer. She was a total Anglophile. And she ran a really tough class. And during the course of the year, we learned British literature from beginning to end. And people dodged her class because she graded hard and would wreck your grade point average. But I took her class and I started writing Elizabethan sonnets for her. And these were really terrible sonnets. They were love sonnets to a girl in the class. And she just would put on them A. She didn't have any comments whatsoever. At the bottom, she'd just put A and give them back to me. So she was very discreet. But she gave me the award for best English student at the end of the year, which the teachers would work up amongst themselves. Even though I had a bad case of senioritis and my grades slacked off in the second semester, she ignored that because she knew that I loved it. So Mrs. Catherine Lee was a crucial force. And by the time I got to college, I considered myself a poet. And that isn't exactly right. I wish it were. I love poetry and I love trying to write it. I still write it. I don't publish it very often. It's not very good compared to my novels, to tell you the honest, but it's fun to try.
Traveling from there through your impressive college educational track, which began with a BA in literature from the University of California, San Diego, and then an MA in English from Boston University. Any professors you'd spotlight here who were mentors or helped evolve your craft as it was developing? And by this time, you'd begin writing and publishing within the short story medium, from what we understand.
Having discovered science fiction at age 18, around age 19, I began to write science fiction short stories, and they were better than my sixth grade efforts. I could tell as a reader. And at a certain point, I learned about the Clarion Science Fiction Writers Workshop. I sent a story off. I got accepted. I couldn't go that summer. They had me promised to come the next summer. They wanted me there. And in the year in between, Damon Knight bought my submission story. So Damon Knight was my first editor and teacher. Lovely man, great editor, great teacher. And so I couldn't have fallen into a better spot in terms of my first sale. My first 4 sales were to him and to his wife, Kate Wilhelm. And it was years later when I shifted over to selling to Ed Furman at Fantasy and Science Fiction, and also Terry Carr for Terry Carr's Universe Trilogy. Well, novels are fantastic. They're a full book. You live in them. It's not just a moment, it's a life. So as much as I admire short stories, they're damned hard to write and they don't have the same impact. And what you need is a really good short story collection to pull a bunch of them together. No one individual short story is going to make much of a mark in readers' minds. They're like appetizers or something.
As you were finishing up with your PhD at UC California, San Diego, I understand it was actually your PhD advisor that first introduced you to legendary science fiction author Philip K. Dick, who you thereafter wound up doing your doctoral thesis on, titled The Novels of Philip K. Dick. What did you absorb from that research, reading this iconic author's full works that would filter down into your own era of science fiction writing to come?
I had another lucky thing in my teachers. I've been very lucky in my teachers. I have to say that, just like blessed. And one of them was Frederick Jameson, America's leading literary critic and the world's leading Marxist literary critic, a guy who changed the world in that he changed all humanities departments in universities across the world. And he was at UC San Diego. And I said to him in an office visit, because he was my French professor, and I had no idea. I said, I'm interested in science fiction. And he lit up and he said, oh, do you know this? And he gave me a copy of Locus. And at that point, Locus was like still stapled on the corner. It was ridiculously early days. This is like 73 or 4. And I said, no, I didn't know about Locus. He gave me Locus and he said, well, if you're interested in science fiction, you should read Philip K. Dick. He's the greatest living American writer, hands down. And I said, I had only read like Galactic Pot Healer. And I was quite startled to think that the author of Galactic Pot Healer was the greatest living American writer. But I figured if Jameson says so, I'll read him. And I did. And Jameson was my thesis advisor until he left for Yale, at which point another great teacher, Donald Westling, who had no interest in science fiction, he read a ton of science fiction just to be my advisor. So I was very lucky at UCSD, and I wrote about Dick. And your first question is very important. What I learned from reading all of them is that you have to get lucky where everything that you're interested in comes together in one book for you really to shine at your best. And that was The Man in the High Castle. All of Dick's, there's probably 15, if you count the unpublished mainstream novels, there's probably 25 novels before Man in the High Castle, which is amazing because it's pretty early in his career. But that's the one where he stopped trying to write mainstream novels and he started putting all of his talents into one book. And that's what you got. I learned that. I learned also that it's important to not have superheroes, to have ordinary people as your protagonists and follow the lives of ordinary people and pay attention to class and pay attention to California, because he was a California anti-capitalist. I mean, his politics were so bizarre that it's hard to characterize them, but for sure he didn't like the business world of post-war America. He always wrote against it. So, and also structurally, the movement, you're inside one character's mind, third person limited point of view, free and direct, whatever you want to call it. Next scene, you're in another character's point of view. You're in their mind looking back at the first character, and that first character looks bizarre. Even though you were just in their head, they begin to look like the enemy or a crazy person. Whereas when you're in their head, they look perfectly sane and normal. Dick does that all the time. And so does Faulkner, for that matter. It's a great method. And I learned that method from reading a lot of Philip K. Dick and seeing how, even though he devotes very little time to his characters, they still feel pretty developed within certain limits because of his methodology, because of that 3D method.
Now, between your MA and your PhD, could you talk a bit about that initial moment of inspiration that led to the 3 books that explore 3 different alternate future histories of Southern California, beginning with The Wild Shore, where little villages of survivors populate the West Coast in the aftermath of a nuclear holocaust? The second, and still celebrated, The Gold Coast, envisions a future Los Angeles circa 2027 as told through the eyes of Jim McPherson and Pacific Edge, which sets itself in 2065 and suggests a bleak future without a more ecologically focused one, with the Greens facing off against the Federals, and everything that follows in the Orange County Trilogy, which kicked off your career. Your passion for the environment and taking care of this planet has woven its way as a signature throughout your entire catalog, beginning with this trio. And many have argued with predictions you made back then on how the world would look in the future that are playing out today with all the crazy, unpredictable global warming weather patterns. Would you share a bit with fans about where that passion began and how you've thematically sought to reflect it in your work over the past 40 years?
I grew up in Orange County, California. When I was young, it was orange groves, lemon groves, avocado groves, eucalyptus tree windbreaks. It was orchard. So it was agriculture, mostly orchards, with some strawberries in the South Orange County. And while I was a child and youth, that got ripped out at 5 acres a day, every day for 10 years. And the city replaced it. So I think when I ran into science fiction, I was like, that's right. That's what reality is. If things change, cities take over. The speed of history was something that I had lived without really understanding it until science fiction came along and explained it to me. So then also, I was an English major and I love American and English literature. And what distinguished some American literature, let's say Faulkner. He grew up in Oxford, Mississippi. Almost every one of his books is set in Oxford, Mississippi. By the time you finish reading Faulkner, which I did in the summer of '73, you know Oxford, Mississippi. And I thought, science fiction doesn't have this. And Orange County is a science fictional place, but people don't know it, but I do. So I decided, and this came to me one night driving from San Diego to Orange County during the drive. I went from city to the Marine Corps Camp Pendleton base, very empty land, back into the city. And I realized it depends on how you treat the land, how it ends up. And I had the trilogy come to me, the Orange County trilogy that I now call 3 Californias. The Wild Shore, these are 3 science fictional standard situations, let's call it. After the nuclear war, that's the Wild Shore. The dystopia of overdevelopment, that's the Gold Coast. And then the utopian novel, the green utopia, that's Pacific Edge. Well, that came to me one night in, like, say, 1972. I didn't know how to write a novel at that point. I was working on it. And it was a long haul to figure out how to write a novel. By the time I finished one off, The Wild Shore, The Memory Whiteness, Icehenge, they were all written in my graduate student years, all mixed up together. But the first one to sell was The Wild Shore, after the fall. Now, I mean, of those three, the one that matters to me is the Gold Coast. That one is my life, my friends, my parents, the 70s in Orange County, as seen through a slightly satirical, slightly dystopian, lens. It's not very dystopian compared to some dystopias, that's for sure. But because it's more realistic, it's sort of a portrait of what the 70s felt like in Orange County. And I'm startled now how close the portrait of my parents is in the Gold Coast. It's a little bit invasive to write about people that straightforwardly, but luckily it's a positive portrait. They themselves approved of it without being particularly happy at being put on the page, but it may be maybe they were, maybe they weren't. I don't know. They're gone now. But I did it. And I recently looked at it again, read a lot of it. And I thought, okay, that's my first really a novel I would stand by, is The Gold Coast. I was really happy that Icehenge came out. I was really happy when The Gold Coast came out, which is like 4 years later, to really set out to the world what I thought I could do as a novelist in something that I'm permanently proud of. I think you got to wait, although I really like Icehenge for that middle novella. You got to wait till the Gold Coast, till I got to the point where I was really happy with having a novel out there.
Now, once you'd sold The Wild Shore and it was published way back in 1984, how did it feel to hold that first book in your hands as a realized dream? And I have to imagine it must have felt amazing to win the Locus Award for Best First Novel the very next year in 1985.
It was a great thing for me with The Wild Shore. Now, I have to say that The Wild Shore came out the same year as Neuromancer. So I won the Locus Award for Best First Novel, but Neuromancer won all the awards that year. So Wild Shore was very much overshadowed, and rightfully so, by Neuromancer, which was cutting edge and which was describing our reality now. Wild Shore, this whole notion of the after the fall, the after the nuclear disaster novel, that's kind of a 1950s science fiction thing that I chose almost arbitrarily to get myself to 3 Orange Counties. And Henry, it's a first person narrative, and Henry's a kind of a naive young kid. It's a Huck Finn imitation, but you can't really imitate Huck Finn. So, it was a complex thing. The science fiction community is my hometown, and it's lovely when they like something. The science fiction fandom is a tight community, and they like their newest writers. They're fond of welcoming a new writer and saying, oh my gosh, another good writer has joined our community. How cool is that? So they're very generous and welcoming. That's important to say.
Touching on a few of your influential early standalone successes in this first era of your catalog, we'd love to transport viewers back to Icehenge, first with what gave you the initial idea to set the book over 3 different time periods told from 3 different character perspectives, specifically those of life systems specialist Emma Wheel in 2020 48 AD, archaeologist Professor Halmer Netherland in 2547 AD, and great-grandson Edmund Doya in 2610 AD following Mars's colonization.
I did them all in a slurry together where the Emma section was only 20 pages long and wasn't well done. Hjalmar Nederland was just mentioned and wasn't hardly in it at all. It was mostly the third one first with a lot of stuff, and it was out of order. I gave it to Damon Knight, and he said, first of all, make a list of the scenes in this novella. It was the longest thing I'd ever written by a long shot. Make a list of the scenes, and then make a list of them in the chronological order in which they happened. And this is basic, but I didn't get it. And he said to me, why have you got it out of chronological order? You can if you want to, but structure it. So if you've got Edmund's story and you're going back to earlier stories, maybe those earlier stories ought to be in chronological order. It was a masterclass in sequencing events. And then he said to me later, he published that third story first. And he said, drop the Emma stuff entirely, write that fuller later. I wrote the Emma story second, and I fleshed it out, and Ed Furman bought it for fantasy and science fiction, and it made a big splash. It was on the Hugo ballot, et cetera, et cetera. And then Ace Books was asking me for a novel after The Wild Shore. And I said, well, I've got these two novellas, and there's really a good story in between the two. They said, yeah, write it. Write the middle story, Hjalmar Nederland. And that's because there was an archaeologist named Hjalmar Holland. So I went from Holland to Nederland, who made these same mistakes as the real character made the same mistakes as my fictional character. And I wrote that middle story, and it's the best one of the three as far as I can tell, but it certainly felt the best because I had more power at that point, and that became Icehenge.
Your short story and novella writing has stayed prolific from day one on as well, including highlights like Black Air, which took home the World Fantasy Award for Best Novella, The Blind Geometer, which won the Nebula Award for Best Novella, Mother Goddess of the World, and other stories like A Martian Childhood, Down and Out in the year 2000, Me in a Mirror, On the North Pole of Pluto, Sacred Space, The Lunatics and To Leave a Mark, while you've been writing a fountain of anthologies over the last 4 decades like Orbit 18, The Planet on the Table, Escape from Kathmandu and Vinland the Dream, among others. How freeing or perhaps more constricting in any way are the short story and novella formats for you? For example, are there any challenges to keeping a story shorter from a world building or a word count perspective?
Black Air was crucial for me. That one, I don't know where it came from. It took me about a month to do the reading and do the thinking and to write it out. I had just gotten together with my wife. I was living here in Davis. I had stability in my life for the first time. Yeah, the rescue of the kid at the end, when the Armada goes down on the coast of Ireland, and this one kid survives to become presumably some kind of local saintly figure. Well, this is a deep, unconscious, dreamlike approach to how I felt in those years, and I think it's still a lovely story. I'm kind of blown away because I don't know where it came from. The Lucky Strike was also very important, written around that same time, an idea that came to me in a flash, and I wrote that one down, and that one also got a good response. And I like The Blind Geometer, sort of. That seems to me like a warning track Homer. There were things I wanted to do that I couldn't accomplish because of my lack of knowledge of geometry. And so it goes on like that. No, the 80s short stories were crucial because of the science fiction community being faithful readers, reading the magazines and the anthologies. It was a tighter community. It was an intense, and it was sort of like a ghetto community in that we were inside a little community that nobody else was paying much attention to. In the larger world, I don't believe there's a single person that probably read Black Air, but inside the science fiction community, practically everybody read it. Now that kind of tight border, this ghetto is inside the walls. That kind of tight wall between your readership and the rest of the world, that doesn't exist anymore. That's been blown up by the internet and by the way that the whole world has become a science fiction place. It means that the small town feeling is kind of gone.
The Memory of Whiteness focuses on the colonization of the larger solar system, and the tour readers are taken on follows through different planets and planetoids occupied by different human societies with a futuristic musical instrument, the Holy Welkin Orchestra, and the central role it plays in the plot that follows, this time on Mercury.
I believe I've written more fiction set on the planet Mercury than any other human being ever, which is a point of pride since it's a pretty spectacular planet and no one else seems to have paid much attention to it. There's one Bradbury short story. There's a supposed fantasy trilogy by E.R.R. Edison set on Mercury, but he didn't pay any attention to the real planet. There was just a name that was exotic. For me, it was a real place because, again, of the robot satellites that have taken photos of it, given us good maps of it. And spectacularly, all of the craters on Mercury are named after artists, composers, painters. this is real. This isn't my invention. It's the Astronomical Society, that you've got Vermeer crater, and then you got Van Gogh crater, and you got Sibelius, and it goes on and on and on. Just like all the craters on Venus are named after women, all the craters on Mercury are named after artists. So it's fabulous.
Mars has long been a popular destination and almost a trope at this point within the science fiction genre. What initially intrigued you about the planet from a scientific standpoint to then lead you to write the Mars Trilogy? We understand some of it came from the scientific research you conducted in Martian geography for Icehenge. Please tell us a bit more about this initial fascination with Mars and how it helped inspire the idea for the now mythic among fans Red Mars, as recently as 2022 noted as being regarded, along with the rest of the trilogy, as the best books written on the subject and a holy grail for science fiction fans.
It was the Viking lander and the Viking orbiter. So 1976, we had Mars handed to us on a plate. And what compared to what we knew before Viking was like giving us that planet, whereas before it had just been a red dot. It had been Bradbury's land. You know, it was a vague place to put your story, and we knew some things, but not many. In fact, Percival Lowell's vision with the canals and everything stayed dominant right up through to the 50s, and then Viking blew it all up. But Viking gave us a place, and I thought, man, at the same time we were given Mars, we were given the concept of terraforming by Carl Sagan and that whole crowd of scientists going, you know, humanity probably has enough technological power to transform a planet to a more Earth-like space. And what's the perfect candidate for it? Oh my gosh, Mars. I think that their interest in terraforming and their interest in Mars were simultaneous. That, in other words, understanding that Mars was within the habitable zone, that it had a lot of frozen water, that it had volatiles, that it could be terraformed, its gravity wasn't horribly light. There's a reason why terraforming theory and Mars knowledge came at the same time. And there I had my story. Let's tell the story of terraforming Mars. Well, now this was daunting. It was going to take a couple hundred years. I needed the multiple point of view. I needed time lapse photography. I needed to invent a style that was neither dramatization nor summarization, but was what a certain critic called the pseudo-iterative, the things that happen every day for a year, except it's not exactly the same thing. The patterns of behavior, if you write those down, and you have the multiple points of view. The Mars Trilogy came together. At that point, it was maybe my sixth or seventh novel, and I just dove off the edge of the diving board.
Looking back on it now, you really broke so much new ground for the genre with Red Mars, in part thanks to what The Atlantic highlighted as a key feature of what makes Robinson's work vital. Rather than just entertaining, it's his depth of the research. Many of the futures and worlds he writes about resemble a world that we might find ourselves living in. In that spirit, you brought a deep understanding of science to the table in the course of creating this Odyssey, which is part of what's made it so authentic with science fiction fans throughout the generations. Who are a few of your most valuable sources that you could tap into as you wrote?
I was breaking all kinds of workshop rules, but I never believed in the workshop rules anyway. So that wasn't much of a stretch for me. And the science fiction readership was totally supportive, which isn't to say that, I mean, the Red Mars was widely hated, but it was more widely loved. It was obviously different. But the great thing to say about the science fiction community, and that's spread to the world at large, is there's a lot of generous readers out there that don't mind a different style if it gets them a good story. And as for the science, I had Chris McKay at NASA Ames. I could call any scientist I wanted on the phone and just try to get them to shut up when I was done with them. They're very generous with their time. They want to talk about their specialty. And the Mars community was tight in those years. I had every Mars book ever written, I swear to God, and it was only like 2 bookshelves total.
This must have provided an infinite, boundless number of new places your imagination then allowed you to take the genre out in a new space, so to speak, throughout the trilogy. What were a few of those workshop rules you broke on your way to realizing your vision on the page?
Well, the obvious one is show, don't tell. And that's a stupid rule. And I've been happy to crush it at every opportunity. Partly the way that gets translated into science fiction is the idea of exposition. Don't have expository lumps. That's old fashioned. What's exposition? It's anything but a dramatized scene. It's even talking about things that aren't humans and their little petty dramas. That's exposition. That's against the rules. That kills science fiction. The golden age of science fiction, they had expository lumps all over the place. And then you got Heinlein, the door dilated, and then he doesn't say anything more, and you're supposed to be impressed by that, and unpack it yourself, and also have the world revealed in tiny little phrases that are tucked into an exciting thriller narrative. Well, that template was wrong all along, and I've been happy to break that one. And we could go more into that, but what I was finding everywhere, the Mars Underground, Chris McKay, Robert Zubrin, Penny Boston, Carol Stoker, these people were at University of Colorado Boulder in the late 70s, and they were planetologists, and the Mars information from Viking was blowing their mind. And so the Mars Underground would stage conferences at Colorado, at Boulder, and put out giant conference books. The Case for Mars, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are big turquoise covered trade paperback style. And they were scientific papers on, well, what's the best glove if you're on the Martian surface? And how would you build bricks out of Martian dust? That kind of detail. And I just gleaned those books. Everything in Red Mars on the technical level comes out of the Mars Underground of the late 70s at Boulder. So there was real scientists who were giving me the stuff that I could then build my society out of. And obviously I needed to do more than just the technical stuff. It was not, I'm not an Andy Weir. We're not going to go into that level of detail at that stuff, but to have that underneath the historical story, the political story, it was very important to making Red Mars feel real.
Readers take flight on the Ares with an unforgettable cast as compelling and key to the story as the backdrop of space they're traveling through, and grow closer to them individually once these first 100 colonists land on Mars. As their creator, who did you grow closest to among the principals throughout writing? Whether we're talking about Russian engineer Nadia Chernevsky, who undersees the construction of the Underhill colony, or Hiroko Ai, the chief of the agricultural team, who pioneers the concept of arephany, or Saxifrage Sax Russell or Anne Claiborne, who stand on opposite ends of terraforming, or Arkady Bogdanov, astronaut John Boone, or survivor Phyllis Boyle on the Green vs. the Reds.
I love that cast. And one of the things is that I don't know any of them. They all came out of nowhere. They all came out of the necessities of the plot. I needed somebody opposed to terraforming. So slowly Anne Claiborne came out of the clay and said, I can do that. I needed a nerd scientist, pure state. And so Sachs, of course. I needed a builder, and I needed Russians and Americans. So I had Nadia and Maya and Arkady. And so they kind of came out of the necessities of the plot, but then they blossomed into real people for me. It was like Calvin and Hobbes. If you remember Calvin and Hobbes, when outside people look at Calvin and Hobbes is this stuffed little doll. And it's very funny because in Calvin's mind, the majority of the comic strip, Hobbes is absolutely fluid, alive. He's more alive than Calvin practically. Well, for me, those characters, I think one thing was giving them a lot of space and time and room to grow, a lot of words. I think the Mars Trilogy is something almost 2,000 pages. So there's a room, and each one of those characters would get an entire novella to themselves. So you'd get Nadia for 50 pages, really get used to her. And then you go to Maya for 40 pages and go, oh my gosh, I never thought of Nadia that way before until Maya looked at her, and vice versa. They're like sisters. It went on like that through the whole thing. And really, none of them are based on anybody, except for a small minor thing, is whenever I wanted Saxifrage Russell to be the purest of pure scientists and say something hilariously scientific, I would think about what my wife would say, because she's a chemist. So there's a lot of my wife in Sax Russell. And that's the only part of the entire Mars Trilogy's cast of characters that has any relation to anybody that I know or I mean, they all come out of me, but it's me reading and thinking and watching other people, but they were new to that plot. Now, say, I put that in distinction to something like the Gold Coast, where my friends and family were obviously, and myself were obviously the basis for those characters. So, but the Mars Trilogy is strong because I got away from autobiography and from personal life and got into something bigger than that.
Expanding that character study as you imagine and then establish the political climate on the planet as it might realistically play out between 2026 and 2061 in the first book. What and who were some of your favorite players and plays to make on the proverbial chessboard, like the United Nations Organization of Mars Affairs, known as UNOMA, or the Frank Chalmers Mars Treaty, or subsequent twists and turns in the story like Bogdanov's Revolution and all that follows after that?
Like, what would be an ecologically based Martian constitution? And right now in Chile, they're trying to write one for a country on Earth to be ecologically based. They're doing a new constitution in Chile to replace the Pinochet monstrosity. And by July of this year, they're going to vote on it, or maybe September this year. And they're trying to put the climate change and the ecology into the Constitution. Well, this is what the Mars Constitution was doing back in, I guess, 1995. So I'm very pleased to see that kind of thing happening. And it was a lot of fun to write.
Time magazine is celebrated as one of the foundations of your writing, the realism with which you treat the changes that you imagine for your characters, calling it fundamental to making your stories of progress convincing and compelling. And by the time we pick up with the colonists' story again in Green Mars, 50 years have passed since the ultimate destruction of most of the first 100 colonizers by the end of Red Mars, and decades later, as the title of the second book reflects, where the terraforming process has evolved to where it's now possible for plants to grow, and with enough time having passed that grandchildren have even joined the growing community of survivors, including new subgroups among them, like the Nisei, the Demi-Mon, and the new group of separatists formed by Arthur Randolph, sent by Praxis on Earth, and resulting in the signing of the Dorsa Brevia Agreement, among other new developments. As an artist blending all these colors together on the canvas, what were some of the most inspiring new creative evolutions in this saga between the multiple generations of Martians?
It was awfully fun to ponder, okay, you've got a very small group of people on Mars. And the kind of Heinlein, Moon is a harsh mistress, the American Revolution analogy, I was very doubtful of that. But nevertheless, those people at some point are going to be thinking of themselves as Martians, not as Terrans. And at that point, they aren't going to want to be bossed around by UNOMA or by corporations. And so how could they become independent when they were so very vulnerable to attack from space? They could pop their shelters like balloons and everybody die inside. I mean, they were vulnerable. So how could they possibly win? And I didn't want to do the Heinlein methodology of kind of waving your hands and saying, although actually a novel crossing 200 years or 250 years is unusual and weird, and you have to have some time jumps to make it work. And I don't like the generational saga where you're at the end of the book, you're reading about the great-great-grandchildren of the characters you really cared about. So even 100 Years of Solitude, which is the greatest generational saga ever written, the characters at the end you don't care about as you do their grandparents, which is the characters you got hooked into at the beginning. So with a lifetime extension, to just say, okay, my characters by a science fiction, it's probably the most fantastical and least likely thing in all the Mars trilogy. People are living to 200, 300 years. And that made it fun for me to stick with characters, follow their aging. It's a perfect metaphor for the way that we age, even in our 70 or 80 years. So it isn't as if we can't relate to it. And it gave me a structure where I could stick with the same characters, but still tell this vast, long story.
How much of a thrill was it for you to continue exploring Mars' surface and skies above with the pen as vividly as you do here for readers? Whether with the asteroid moon Phobos in Red Mars or in Green Mars, introducing new evolutions for the reader, like the newly evolving Mars biosphere, continent-sized orbital mirrors, space elevators, and the ever-presence of mole holes, among other elements. Please elaborate for viewers on the creation of these or any of your favorite aspects you added here to credibly and completely tell this story.
My big helper, you'll see him in the acknowledgments with the extra thanks on all three books, Charles Sheffield, English science fiction writer, not very much older than me, died young of a cancer. I mean, he was 67, but I regard that as very young. And he was a space scientist, full-on space scientist. So when I asked him, how much would you have to slow Phobos down to make it crash into Mars? He came with a ream of calculations that he had run on his computer to show me. And he could have just said me a word. He could have said, well, say X or Y. And actually, Chris McKay is much smarter about this. Chris McKay says, never put the numbers in. Don't let people check your numbers. Just say it, which is something I wish I had remembered my whole life. In any case, Charles Sheffield helped me a lot. And when I asked him in Green Mars, how much would you have to speed Deimos up to get it out of Mars orbit? His eyebrows shot up. He's like, Stan, what have you got against the moons of Mars? But he calculated that also. And also, which way would the space elevator fall if you were to detach the rocket top? Does it go to the left? Does it go to the right? Or does it go west or east? He had to calculate that and tell me how fast it was going when it whipped around Mars. And I hear that the people who made the TV show of Foundation ripped that scene out of Red Mars for Foundation, which is a glorious joke if it's true. I haven't seen it, but for sure the space elevator coming down was a Charles Sheffield assisted extravaganza.
This book ends in a sense much as the first one did, this time with a natural environmental disaster, with suddenly rising sea caps back on Earth, causing massive catastrophic flooding that changes the power dynamic back on Mars in the end, without giving too much away for viewers who haven't read it yet. Once again here, your books almost seem prophetic in warning Earth of what was coming our way if we didn't start cleaning up the planet ASAP. What led you back then to fear we might see something of a mirror between the extreme weather in your book and what we're actually seeing happen in the 2020s?
The flooding of the Earth by the detachment of the West Antarctic ice sheet. There was a guy, Donald, his last name begins with a W. It's slipping my mind right now, at University of Texas. He's in the acknowledgements. He's in University of Texas. I got him on the phone. I said, West Antarctic ice sheet, it could, if there was a volcanic eruption, the ice would come off and sea level would go up like 10 meters, 12 meters. How fast could that happen? He says, really fast. I said, how fast? He goes, well, 500 years. I'm going, no, wait, I want it like 6 months. And he's going, well, you're a science fiction writer, do it. And I said, well, but justify it. He said, if you had a volcanic eruption that was big enough there, and it's a highly volcanic area, it could happen. So I ran with that. And then the ramifications of, okay, Earth is in a mess. In 6 months, sea level is up 10 meters. I've played this game often since then. It's such a startling story. And not only that, but it's happening to us in slow motion, real time now. So then following the ramifications, going back to Earth in Blue Mars, visiting it, seeing what it's like down there, that was the most fun part. That was a really interesting political evolution to follow.
Blue Mars measures the long-term results of terraforming and picks back up with Accelerando, which is essentially another prediction of human ambition, where we spread human populations throughout the entire solar system beyond Earth. Did you actually visualize all this in your mind as you were writing, or even have it all physically mapped out in terms of the series timeline before beginning work on the third book? And would you pull the curtain back for fans a bit on what that exactly looks like as you're outlining? Be it chalkboards around the room or index cards connected on poster boards by string, in a computer or even on star charts.
Not very much. I really was going by the seat of my pants with the idea that let's keep terraforming and see what happens. By the end, I wanted there to be a little ocean and the Hellas Sea. By the end, I wanted an atmosphere and kind of shirt sleeves walking around, and to reconcile the red-green dichotomy by the incredible vertical scale of the Martian landscape. In other words, you can terraform the lower elevations of Mars, and the highest elevations of Mars will stick right out of the atmosphere, and you still got the original Mars, about 30% of Mars. It's amazing. So I wanted that, but the details I didn't have. I just took it one chapter at a time and saw where it went, and that made it exciting for me.
Now, the asteroid cities you create here that orbit Mars' atmosphere are particularly fascinating. Along with those, any other new adaptations to or expansions of technology or scientific innovations you added on or in space surrounding the planet that were especially thrilling for you as you wrote?
The trip where I think it's Anne, is kind of an ironic thing. I send Anne out to see the terraforming of the rest of the solar system, a kind of a spectacular jump in the plot of Blue Mars, where you've been on Mars for so long and so focused on it, and then suddenly you realize that it's just a stepping stone to the rest of the solar system. A good slap in the face for the reader late in the Mars trilogy. That all comes out of Icehenge and out of the stuff that I was doing in the 70s, a solar system-wide civilization. And hollowing out an asteroid is very much like an O'Neill colony from the early 70s. You can build them out of aluminum and put them in Earth orbit. That was O'Neill. But you could also take, if you had a solid enough asteroid, you could hollow it out, spin it. On the inside, you've got gravity and you've got some safety from radiation. It's actually quite a practical plan compared to most space plans. And I say that because they're all impractical, but that one at least spares you the problems of exposure to radiation and holding an atmosphere to a, like say you take the biggest asteroids, Ceres and Vesta. Well, how would you hold an atmosphere to them on the outside? And also, how would you stay on the ground when gravity is like 0.08? So you'd be bouncing around up there like you're on a trampoline, and probably your heart and your whole body would begin to fall apart for lack of gravity. But if you're on the inside of an asteroid and it's spinning up to 1G and you're walking around, you got a bit of a Coriolis effect. It wouldn't be the greatest thing in the world, but it'd be way better than being on the outside of a small body, probably even better than being on Mars. So that was an early thing that I could drag in to make it more cosmic, make it, make it even more of a saga, make it bigger.
Please tell viewers a bit about the entertaining reunion that takes place at Underhill to recover memories, including Russell and Anne Claiborne, Maya, and other original characters near the end of the book.
Those beginning characters, Sax and Maya, and the various people that survive, I think they have a reunion at the end of Blue Mars. One of the funnest things I ever wrote, because it's kind of, they all take a memory drug. So they're tripping and they're at Underhill, which is shut down and is archaeological. And there's maybe, I don't know, 10 or 15 of them left out of the first 100.
Beyond that first generation of colonizers, by the conclusion of Blue Mars, were you sad in a way to be saying goodbye to the main characters from the original 100 survivors or their offspring? Whether we're talking about Hiroko Ai or Desmond Coyote Hawkins, or Mikel Duval, or Vlad Teniv, or Kesai, or Nergal, Jackie, Zoya Boone, Peter Claiborne, or others that come to mind?
I did get into some of the great grandchildren, a little bit. Zobun and Nergal he was the big stand-in for the younger generation of native Martians. There's no one that even comes close to him for amount of exposure and page time and interior reflection. But putting Zoe in there as a brief meteor flash was important. That trick comes out of War and Peace. Late in War and Peace, somebody's nephew is a viewpoint character up until he does something stupid and gets himself killed. I took that straight out of War and Peace, that trick. Some of them, it was just very sad to see them go. The French psychologist, Michel, I just thought to myself, people do die. You can't be unrealistic and have all your favorite characters survive. We had lost Frank and John so early on that I was very grabby. I didn't want any other major characters to go. And with the lifetime extension, I didn't see why I had to. So I hung on to them pretty hard. And it was really very important to me. And how can I say it? Very satisfying to see Nadia get together with Art, to see Maya hanging in there in a kind of solitude at that point through all of her troubles. What a dramatic, a drama queen, an opera star of a character, Maya. And then also Sax and Anne getting together at the end in a kind of reconciliation of red and green. Well, these were all just super satisfying to me. I felt like, at the end of a novel this long, the reader, deserves to have some happy endings happen.
They do, and that's wonderful advice. Along the same lines, as well as you'd gotten to know them by then as an ensemble, how well do you think an author needs to know their characters to have a sense of, say, what decision they'd make in an important moment of consequence for the story? Or, for example, where they need to head in their longer-term story arc?
Yeah, sure. Almost all of them. But let's just say the Mars Trilogy works that way. And so does the Gold Coast. So these are two prime examples from now that's early in my career. Even the Mars Trilogy is 25 years in the past. To a certain extent, Green Earth, my Washington DC trilogy. This kind of reflective style where you see characters from other characters' points of view. You do need to you have to plump down on that method. It's not going to come to you by accident. So in a way, I guess you would say Ministry for the Future. My latest novel uses that in a more diffuse way. Certainly multiple points of view. I have very often done that, yeah. I would pay close attention to choices about first-person narratives and third-person narratives, and forget about second person. That's a party trick. But first person and third person are very important. And what you get out of them is the testimonial. First person, you got characterization even from your narrator. because your narrator is a character and is revealing themselves in every sentence. That's powerful, but it's also limited because you can only stick with what that person sees. Third person, you can have a narrator that knows more, that summarizes, that does all these important things that first person can't quite do. You should play a lot with both of them. You should even maybe try as an experiment writing a short story in first person and then rewriting it in third person, to see the differences, see what works and what doesn't work. And writing a lot of short stories is advisable before you get into a novel if you're a beginner, because a novel is going to take 2 years and a short story is going to take 2 weeks. And if you go down a rabbit hole and you're doing something that the fundamental idea is flawed, or you lose your way because novels are weird and hard, then you've burned 2 years in something that you'll have to put in your trunk. And even if an editor 10 years later asks for it because you've written a better novel later, you will besmirch your career by letting that thing out of the trunk. So write short stories, write a ton of short stories. And then Kate Wilhelm said this, they keep getting longer. And when they're long enough, you maybe got 3 novellas that make a novel, like my Icehenge, like Gene Wolfe's Fifth Head of Cerberus, or like Theodore Sturgeon's More Than Human. 3 novellas that link up and tell a larger story. That's a science fiction form. And it's not right to call it the fix-up, as John Clute calls it in his encyclopedia. As great as John is, that's a bad name, because it's not just fixing up for commercial terms. That might have happened in the 40s, but it's actually a plan. It's a structure that works really well for early writers, beginning writers, because you write a novella, it works. Oh my gosh, well, there's ramifications from another character maybe 10 years later. You write that up. And then if you get a third one or one in between, you've got a novel, and you haven't had to plot an entire novel as an early act, because that is an artificial hard thing to do.
What are any tips that you'd give the aspiring science fiction author specifically on the art of naming characters?
That's one space where the novel is a game that you're playing, and the reader knows they're reading a novel. So I go with Charles Dickens, for instance, where the novel can be symbolic. I mean, grind, you have to grind to graduate. I mean, very often Dickens's names are symbolic of the character's attributes. And I've always enjoyed that. So Anne Claiborne, Claiborne for a red, it's obviously symbolic. It goes on and on like that. Saxifrage is Latin. It's a flower, but it's Latin for rock breaker. So you got a terraformer, you got saxifrage. Why not? Because people are not fooled. If you have a name out of the phone book, you have not fooled your readers into thinking, oh, this really happened. They always know they're reading a novel, and it's one of the few places where you can play the game of symbolism and get away with it. Now, you can go too far. I think that Neil Stevenson, a great science fiction writer, in Snow Crash, where he has a character named Hero Protagonist, that's going too far. That's the name of his protagonist in Snow Crash, Hero, Hiero, protagonist. Well, that just kind of slung me out. Every time I ran into that, is a kind of a wink and a nod, or a gesture towards satire, that I'm reading something that isn't even trying to be keep a veil of a gloss of realism in what's happening. And with a novel reading, I think you need that gloss. You need to be thinking first, yeah, this really happened. And then in the back of your mind, you're judging it as a work of art also. You don't want to be poked in the stomach every time you have a character name that, oh yeah, this is a fiction. Oh yeah, this is a satire. So you can go too far. And I think Neil did in that case. But for the most part, I like to pick names for having some kind of a resonance. And sometimes I don't. John Boone, well, that's like John Glenn. It's like Daniel Boone. It's as obvious as hell that John Boone is an American hero astronaut. Frank Chalmers, well, that's not at all obvious, except for all of my characters who are duplicitous, who are hiding themselves from the world. They're all called Frank. I have probably 5 or 6 Franks through the course of my career. And it's a little joke, a very stupid joke. All my Franks are liars. So the ostensible meaning of Frank, like he's very open, that you're very a frank person. No, my Franks are all liars.
Trying to measure the influence of this series upon contemporary or future science fiction would be like trying to map out a galaxy. Slate would, for instance, report that you broke into the upper echelons of science fiction writers with this landmark trilogy. Also about the practicalities of building a utopia and never looking back. But as we stop here for a moment to do so, whether it's on how the series swept the awards circuit on release, starting with Red Mars taking home the British Science Fiction Award and then the Nebula Award for Best Novel, while you won back-to-back Hugo and Locus Awards for Best Science Fiction Novel for Green Mars and then Blue Mars. It would be stunning, I'd imagine, for any author if you sit back and survey the sheer influence and the way that the Mars Trilogy has resonated and rung so true with peers, critics, and most importantly readers then and now.
I was very surprised. Red Mars was an absolute turning point in my career. In funny ways, before Red Mars, I was a literary science fiction writer, which is a horrible adjective to show that you're supposedly a better writer than the rest of the community. This is bullshit. The whole thing, literary science fiction, was people who were ashamed of science fiction. I hated that. It's chicken shit to try to put adjectives on to say you're better than the rest of your own genre. And I didn't agree with it. After Red Mars, I was a hard science fiction writer. And that's not true either, because I'm not a scientist and I don't get into the numbers much. And I like to do things that aren't very scientifically defensible, but that's true of all of supposedly hard science fiction. And what I'd say is get rid of all the adjectives. Science fiction is science fiction is science fiction. Be proud. Don't try to denounce it. Don't call it speculative fiction or speculative culture. Don't call it fantasy unless it is fantasy or fantastica or any of these other names. Science fiction is my hometown, and I'm not going to renounce it or redefine it or say that it has to be transcended. All that is preciosity and arrogance and nonsense. The genre is strong. You operate the genre right. You use its rules to the story's advantage. You come up with something good. It doesn't need any adjectives. So the Mars Trilogy, I mean, to get back to the heart of your question, it changed my life, my career trajectory. It's one of those magnitude or two magnitude leaps that can happen if you're lucky. It doesn't guarantee the rest of your career. It's been a roller coaster ride, but it's always there in my back pocket. It makes me feel very bold, like, okay, I'll try this idea. It may fail, but I wrote the Mars Trilogy, so who cares? So I've been very bold and even careless in the years since then because I don't care, because I have that novel. I think of it as a single novel, like a Victorian three-decker. It's one story. It's like, well, Lord of the Rings. Is that a novel? Yes, it is. It's not. A trilogy is a weird way of talking about a very long novel. Well, that one, I don't know where it came from. I couldn't reproduce it now. And so it was like a gift from the gods, really.
Is it true that you were inspired to write your novel Antarctica by a trip you actually took there first?
I got sent to Antarctica by the National Science Foundation. It was fabulous. It gave me the novel Antarctica, which I love, and a kind of transitional novel. But man, it was so fun to write about a place I'd really visited after 10 years of being on Mars. To go to Antarctica and have the locals tell me all their jokes and all their details and be able to write like a reporter. And so that was an experience that was profound. And it was like my reward for the Mars Trilogy, because it was the Mars Trilogy that got the NSF to agree to send me down there.
The fountain of inspiration from this trip to Alaska expanded from there into another trilogy, initially known as Science in the Capital, featuring 40 Signs of Rain, 50 Degrees Below, and 60 Days of Counting, and then condensed into Green Earth in more recent years. Please talk about how your research and findings there helped inform the writing that followed.
After I got back, I began to be on the NSF juries for the subsequent trips to Antarctica. So I would go to their buildings, I would be on their juries. I saw how they gave their grants. I saw it was a very human process. It's like a jury. It's very much on the jury model. And what you see there is it could be gamed. Someone could cheat, someone could try to steal work for commercial purposes rather than give it to the nation. That happens a lot. Not so much inside NSF as outside NSF. And so I wanted to write about that and about climate change, because in 2002, abrupt climate change came into the vocabulary. They saw in the ice of Greenland that weather had changed from warm and wet to cold and dry in 3 years. And it blew their minds, and they had remember that 500 years is like really a short for geologists. So 3 years was like instantaneous to them. And they're thinking, what the hell happened? And I decided I'd write that happening to us right now, abrupt climate change, and see what the NSF would do about it. So those were the things that I thought I would try in the DC trilogy. It talk about warning track homers. The DC trilogy is a mess. And when I condensed it down to Green Earth, I got a lot happier with it.
You really effectively continue to focus the spotlight on environmental disasters caused by human mismanagement of the earth in Shaman, a novel of the Ice Age, and then in New York 2040, where the city has been flooded and altered by the rising ocean levels around it. Has this been more out of a sense of duty to advocacy, or as an author that you spotlighted and plotted around these themes? Or has it been more simply driven from a good storytelling perspective?
I come at it mainly as a science fiction writer and as a novelist, and they are the best stories. So they have the plausibility of not only, yeah, that could happen, which is what science fiction depends on as opposed to fantasy. You say, yeah, that could happen. And sometimes you stretch the boundaries there, but not only could happen, but it will happen, and it is happening. And so it's like a realism as well as a science fiction story. And it struck me as just, this is an exciting story to tell. No one's told this story before. Now, how often does that happen? There's 10,000 novels published per year. How often do you get the chance to tell a story that has not been told before? Rare. But science has given us these new stories. So, and climate change is one of them. So I went with that, and that's driven a lot of what I've done. I like the political aspect of it and the warning aspect of it and giving people news they didn't have. But also, I like it that this is an exciting new story that hasn't been told before by any other novelist.
The LA Times would hail 2312 as perhaps your finest novel, a treasured gift to fans of passionate storytelling. The often mind-blowing scope eclipsed only by your genius-level portrait of one of the greatest odd couples in the history of science fiction. Taking a look at the 2013 Nebula winner for Best Novel, what was the most fun about creating Terminator on the planet Mercury?
In my workshop vocabulary, I would call it the setting. The setting can become like a character. It doesn't have agency, but it has a huge impact in terms of atmosphere, feeling, mood, and individuality to that novel. Like, okay, there's lots of stories about people not getting along, but if they're not getting along and they're in Oxford, Mississippi, or if they're on the surface of Mercury, that place becomes like a character. So I love that aspect of it. And 2312, the Terminator is what astronomers call the zone between light and dark on a planet that moves. And it moves very slowly on Mercury, so slow that you could walk as fast as it, which cracked me up.
Ships that fly to space are as hot a phenomena as ever in the 21st century age of Elon Musk's SpaceX and Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic, and are part of the bread and butter for science fiction fans. And in Aurora, you actually construct a spaceship the book is built around, designed for a human colony to survive on. How much of it did you physically sketch out on the page in the course of first visualizing it? And what were a few of your favorite future features, so to speak?
And indeed, my ship turned out to even be the narrator of Aurora. And that was the best part of Aurora for me, was finding the right narrator and having it be an artificial intelligence. It amused me. Every sentence was fun to write, trying to think, could a computer even think up this stuff? And in workshops, I talk about camera eye point of view. You're stuck outside people's thoughts, and you just say what you see and what you hear. Well, this was a classic case of camera eye point of view, and it made me laugh. As for the spaceships, Aurora was partly an attempt to kill off that whole genre. That's why people hate it so much, because I seem to be saying that it won't work. A multi-generational spaceship won't work. I think that's right. It won't work. It's a literary landscape only. But I would refer you to Gene Wolfe's The Whorl, which is a gigantic asteroid with an interior spin, exactly like we were talking about earlier. And this is the book of the long sun and the book of the short sun. So 7 volumes in a row that form one coherent novel. 4 volumes, they're getting there. The last 3 volumes, they're there in a 2-planet system, which was Wolfe's favorite, where he exploited that in Fifth Head of Cerberus so beautifully. Wolfe was a genius. He's one of the greatest science fiction writers of all time, absolutely in the top 5 without a shadow of a doubt. it's a silly game to play, but and I don't, and you never want to say the best because there are different kinds of ways of being good. But he is one of the greatest science fiction writers we ever had. And the Book of the Long Sun is the great multi-generational starship novel without a shadow of a doubt, to my mind as a reader. So for me to, puncture a hole in the side of the spaceship like Aurora does, it's a irritating to younger science fiction writers. Like, hey, you're killing our vibe here. This is a great story space, and you just played the realist game on it and punctured it like a tire. Now they're playing with a flat tire, and that's their problem. That's not my problem. I needed to say that.
When did you decide to set Red Moon both in China and on the moon in 2047? And in your research, how possible is it in the near or farther out future we could see a scenario like this one play out?
Almost nothing, barely anything. The moon is the most boring body in the solar system. And one of the only values of it is we can indeed get there and come back on a 3-day trip or less. And that makes it mildly interesting, but not very much. The things that I had to seize on were these. There's water at the North and South Pole. And so we're going to be going to the North and South Pole. This is somewhat news. Then secondly, and then you have permanent sunlight at the North and South Pole. And so you don't have that weird 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off of light. And then secondly, li, li, libration. It's because it's not libation, which is a drink. Libration, the moon is rocking a little as it looks at us under tidal forces. And Galileo was the first one to observe this. And I love this because of my Galileo novel with his telescope. He said it's like a man shifting his face from side to side while shaving. And he knew how far it went. And on that zone, all the way around the planet, there's going to be Earthrise and Earthset. Because what people haven't really worked out in their heads is if you're out in the middle of the moon, like in the Man in the Moon's Left Eye or whatever, anywhere, the Earth is going to be sitting up in the sky in the same spot all the time, like the North Star. It'll make a minor shifts, but hardly anything, and just sit up there. It will go through phases over the course of the day or the month, I forget which, but it won't move. And so you don't get Earthrise, you don't get Earthset, except on that narrow zone around the planet between the Earth facing and the Earth not facing hemispheres. So these were the minute new factoids that I could exploit to make good news stories from. But by and large, between the moon being too small and China being too big, I had a heck of a time in Red Moon making a story that I enjoyed. I pulled it off, I think. It's a much smaller scaled. I had to focus in on just 3 characters. I had to focus in on just like a year or less, maybe. Yeah, maybe less. 6 months. And so it's a different style than most of my novels. And it's partly because of this problem of the moon being too small and China being too big.
You traveled back in time to the Great Plague that destroyed Europe in the year of rice and salt. What first gave you the idea to set out writing this alternative history?
Well, because it's immensely long, and it is indeed a very long novel. It covers 700 years. It had to solve all kinds of problems. It's a reincarnation novel. So for once, I'm not doing science fiction and getting into all kinds of metaphysical or philosophical areas with reincarnation, or what is it really, especially if you don't believe in it. As a literary device, it was wonderful, but it's an alternative history. I think alternative history is a valid and pretty important part of the science fiction gang of subgenres, because you can do history. You can make it very clear that science fiction is about history that you can't know because it's in the future, or it's before writing, like the deep past. Prehistoric fiction is part of science fiction, weirdly. The alternative history, that's history. We can't know it because it didn't happen that way. It's an alternate timeline. So the methodology is exposed, and they are new stories by definition. If you tell the story of something obscured going different, then you're the first one to explore that alternative timeline. And so for pure storytelling, I think it's a great story space, alternative history. So Years of Rice and Salt, yeah, that's definitely one of my favorites. For a long time, I would have said it's the one most important to me on an emotional level.
The Ministry of the Future, your most recent novel and the esteemed opinion of the Sierra Club, finds Robinson quickly hitting his groove, using a variety of voices to lend verisimilitude to the scenes he conjures. Earnest or angry, he also has a wry sense of humor that's especially welcome when he's writing at length about politics and global economics, and ranks among Robinson's best recent works. What sort of a different approach did you take, if any, within crafting this novel versus past projects to keep it exciting for you as you were writing?
Well, the desperation of climate change, the very first chapter of Ministry for the Future is a kind of a punch in the face or a punch to the gut, and not typical of my fiction at all, which is mostly utopian and positive. But the problem is we could be cooking people, poaching them, a high enough heat and humidity in combination and people die. And since you're in Nashville, you know what I'm talking about. The wet bulb 35, the one of the highest wet bulb temperatures, which is an index that combines heat and humidity to make one number. One of the highest wet bulb temperatures ever recorded was outside of Chicago. And the American South is highly susceptible to heat humidity combos. Washington, DC, all of the American Southeast, not the Southwest because it's so dry. You need humidity to make the human body fail to cool itself by sweating. And at a certain point, it's only electricity that will keep you alive. And if the power system goes down, you are cooked, and within hours you die of hyperthermia. There is no, you could be naked with a fan on you indoors in the shade and still die from being internally cooked. So this is news, and it needed to be said to people that we cannot let climate change continue the way that we are without putting a third of humanity and about half of the land surface of the earth in immediate danger of catastrophes where only if the electricity keeps working do people actually survive it. And the more you're health compromised, if you're young, if you're old, if you have any health problems, the more likely you are to die in these heat waves. And now they're studying it. But when I heard the news, which is maybe 2017, I said, I got to write about this climate change. It's even worse than the DC trilogy suggested, which was already pretty bad. I needed to come back to the topic. So I did. And in terms of being a novelist, the exciting thing was to make it something that was still interesting and even enjoyable to read was precisely this point of view thing I've talked about earlier, the eyewitness account. First person, for sure, but a character that you don't know their name, you don't know their backstory. These are kind of like short stories, first person point of view, but an eyewitness account is a genre in real literature of people who saw something or did something, and 10 years later, they're asked to recount what they saw and to judge it really as to its effect on them and on history. That's so different than what fiction usually does. So it's precisely, you're telling, not showing. You're judging it. You're doing all the things that the workshops tell you not to do. So that's one reason I love it, because these are very compelling narratives. They're usually only 3 or 4 pages long. I wrote about 40 of them for Ministry for the Future. It's the way that novel is structured and the way it gets told is to be a Greek chorus of scores of voices, and you don't know these people except for the one thing they need to tell you. So it doesn't function like characters in novels usually function. For that function, I have Mary and Frank, just a 2-character novel with some minor characters who have a little bit of prominence, particularly Badim, the kind of mysterious head of the Black Wing. So that's very few characters for a novel that long, because it's a novel written by way of eyewitness accounts and by other kinds of narrative. So that kept it exciting and fresh for me. And there was a sense also of urgency that this news needed to get out there, that we can't let climate change keep going.
Even with legacy acknowledgments like in 2016 with the Robert A. Heinlein Award for your entire body of work, and equally as prestigiously in 2018 when you won the Arthur C. Clarke Award for Imagination to Service in Society, Time magazine recently recognized you as one of the most accomplished and popular writers working in science fiction today. It must feel nice to be equally respected by the veterans as you are relevant with these new 2020s science fiction readers around the world.
I love those things very much. They mean a lot to me. For one thing, I am a citizen of the hometown of science fiction. So Clarke and Heinlein, I talked to Clarke on the phone several times from his place in Sri Lanka. He would call me on the phone. because he read my Mars books and he liked them and he liked to talk to people, and he was in Sri Lanka. So he would have been using Zoom every day for 10 hours if he had had Zoom. And so he had video phones, early video phones, and he'd talk to you on the phone. Once by accident, he called me on my birthday. I mean, he didn't know it was my birthday, but it was a special birthday for me. Heinlein I never met nor had much contact with, nor am I much impressed by his books or his politics. But Heinlein, he invented the phrase "pay it forward." He started blood banks. His politics were not as obviously bad and fascistic as they sometimes look. In fact, he was crazy Bob Heinlein when he was in LA with the LA Science Fiction Society in the 40s, and had interest in all kinds of peculiar stuff coming out of Margaret Mead. He was a mixed picture and a pretty skillful writer, not great, not horrible. He gets lionized in the science fiction community as if he was some kind of great artist. I don't think that's right, but he was an interesting figure. And besides, it doesn't matter. He was one of the grandfathers. He was one of the golden age monster figures. And I like Clark, Bradbury more, but Heinlein, getting the Heinlein Award was a community of people. Heinlein's gone. It's people who like and care about his legacy enough to give me that award, being an obvious leftist, an obvious hippie. Well, Heinlein in 1940 was an obvious leftist and an obvious hippie. So what I want to say is that I appreciate that group of people thinking that I was worthy of that award. It meant a lot to me.
What about the magic number 72432, Kim Robinson? The name of your very own asteroid, first discovered by astronomer Donald P. Prey in 2001, which he named after his favorite science fiction author. That must have been a touching tribute.
Well, this is entirely due to amateur astronomer Donald Prey. Because if you discover an asteroid, you get to name it. And so he chose to do that it's a kind of a fan. Another fan, Stuart Atkinson, once mailed me a chunk of Mars because the SNC meteorites come from Mars and landed on Earth, and you could buy them back in the 80s and 90s. And he sent me a few grams of Mars as a gift, and Donald Prey named this asteroid as a gift. I love it. It's great.
Esquire correctly crowned you a science fiction titan in 2022. How do you feel about the way your catalog has helped reinvent, reshape, and indisputably evolve the way people think about reading and writing science fiction, and maybe elevate the awareness of the way life could imitate art if we're not careful with the way we take care of the spaces around and above us?
Well, I am proud to follow the lead of the generation that came before. They had a tougher time than I did. I compare it to breaking down a brick wall by running into it with your forehead. So the generation of the 1950s, that broke their foreheads. Their careers are busted. And Asimov went into nonfiction, and he was a prolific and confident man, and wrote nonfiction for 15, 20 years to dodge this problem of science fiction being looked down on. But Bester, Cordwainer Smith, Damon Knight, Fred Pohl, the list could be extended forever. And all of those people had busted careers and were getting paid $1,000 advances and not able to make a living at science fiction. Yeah, and Philip K. Dick was one of them, and he got over it by taking amphetamines and writing 5 novels a year and dying at age 52 of a stroke. That was probably somewhat due to taking too much speed to write his novels to make a living. So that was bad. Then came the 60s. Right before me, the 60s was a science fiction moment, and you had a group of brilliant writers, and they began to bust out. And the leader of the pack in terms of busting out was Ursula Le Guin, pretty obviously. But Tom Dish, Samuel Delaney, Joanna Russ, Kate Wilhelm, translating the Strugatskys and Lem. In the 60s, science fiction became cool, and it became the best literature being written. That wasn't true in the 50s, but it was true in the 60s. So I come along in the 70s and the early 80s. It's like the brick wall has been busted down. And so at that point, do you charge through into the big world saying, hey, we got the news here. We got the best, liveliest genre going. The best way to talk about the best realism of our time is what we're doing. Or do you stay inside and pretend that the brick wall is still there and complain vociferously and stay and never leave the borders of your town and stay indoors? Well, that's not right. It took a lot of effort to break that brick wall down. You don't continue now to complain about the brick wall when there's a big hole in it and the whole world is interested in science fiction. This is maybe a problem that's somewhat gone away. I think younger writers now understand that they are the big world, that there isn't a ghetto wall, that there isn't a small town anymore, and they've got to get by in the big city. And it's a little scary and weird compared to when you were comfortable in your hometown. I mean, I think psychologically, as how do you orient and identify as a writer, it's harder now to figure out. It's harder now to be a science fiction writer. What does that even mean now? Maybe it doesn't mean what it did when I was young, because that's really a long time ago. But I see this evolution. And so for me, I'm just grateful to all the generations that came before, because what I could do is go out there and say, look, people, this is the best, most relevant genre going. I make no excuses. I'm a science fiction writer. Why aren't you? Because you're doing crap. You know, you're doing stuff 50 years off the cutting edge. You're totally irrelevant. You're in I get really hard on literary fiction, which is already another one of those contradiction in terms. Like, why is that adjective even there? And I say, look, you know, good for you, but what a waste of literary energy to be stuck in 1950. So I'm very much aggressive, probably because I'm as old as I am. I still have a chip on my shoulder. And to end of this, I think it's Le Guin was the crucial figure who blew out of that brick wall, and when it was a very small break, and she extended it by being who she was.
And that spirit, where can fans around the world look forward to blasting off to with you next?
I do have a book. It's nonfiction, first one since the novels of Philip K. Dick. It's called The High Sierra, A Love Story. So it is a backpacking guide, a memoir, history, geology. It's everything that I found interesting about my interactions with the Sierra Nevada of California. I've seen the book. It looks really good. It's got photos, maps, diagrams, woodblock prints by Tom Killian. It's pretty beautiful as an object. And it's got my story. I've never told my story. I touched on it in fiction in joking ways in the Gold Coast and in the DC trilogy. But this time I told my story as a science fiction writer that was obsessed with going to the Sierra Nevada. So memoir, it's not a good form. Like eyewitness account is a good form because people are witnessing, they saw something important. Memoir is like, oh, my life, let me tell you all about it. It's, you got to be kidding me. Especially if you've had a life like mine, which is basically a suburban house husband and Mr. Mom. I got nothing when it comes to memoir. A privileged life, a lot of time to write, a great family, big deal. I wouldn't want to waste people's time with that. But my Sierra life had some interesting adventures and stories. So that will come out in May, which is a month from now when we're recording this. And after that, I got nothing. I'm thinking of writing a play. I'm gonna try to get back to science fiction in much shorter forms. I'm gonna try to become a specialist of the novella, and I'm gonna see if Ministry of the Future kind of stands as my last long novel. I mean, We'll see what happens. But I think I've imposed on my readership often enough. That's a lot of long novels if you look back at it.
Readers no doubt have their favorites. Among your catalog, do you have your own, either in their writing or how they impacted the world on release?
The Mars Trilogy is central to my career. Ministry for the Future has changed my life. But in terms of the writing experience and my imagined reading experience, because I don't really read them, I can't. A Shaman, I'm very fond of. Galileo's Dream, I'm very fond of. Years of Rice and Salt, I think, is one of my monsters. For a long time, I would have said it's the one most important to me on an emotional level.
Finally, this has already felt like a PhD level masterclass in writing so far. Any expert final bits of creative counsel you'd add to the conversation?
Well, I think one thing that's very, very helpful is to put it into your schedule of daily life, and don't shirk it when it comes up in your schedule. I did that when I was a teacher. So I would teach Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I would write Tuesday, Thursdays. I wouldn't skip Tuesday and Thursdays and do something else. So put it in your schedule because it's time intensive. And if you have to say, well, I'm either going to write or I'm going to go swimming, or I'm either going to write or I'm going to do research, or I'm either going to write or I'm going to go watch TV, or I'm going to check out what Twitter has to say today, you'll always do the easier thing. And there's nothing harder than writing first draft. So if you put it into your schedule, like, oh God, it reminds me of my swim team exercises. You're dreading it and you jump into the pool and it's cold water and it's like, God, why did I do this? But the moment you swim even one lap, you remember, oh yes, it's because I like this. And if you don't like it, you're in the wrong business. You're in the wrong hobby. You got to like it. The act of writing sentences has to be a pleasure to you. And at that point, if it is, you got to schedule it in and take the dive and do it 3 times a week, 4 times a week, and stick with it. Sticking with it. That's what I'd advise to people. It's not a dilettante exercise. It's not something you can do and then not do. You got to devote yourself and devote a fair bit of time to it. And then you'll make some progress. You'll get some readers.
Dr. Robinson, thank you first for all you've contributed to pushing science fiction's frontiers out into the future for generations of writers, past, present, and to come. And thank you so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV. It's been an honor.
Been fun. All right. Bye-bye.